The air was cool that morning, sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. I had been clipping the last of the roses along the fence when I heard the crunch of tires on my gravel drive. Rowena stepped out first, her hand clutching the handle of a suitcase that looked too heavy for her frame. Ethan followed, pulling 2 more bags from the back of the SUV, and then, as if choreographed, Claudine emerged from the passenger side in her silk scarf and oversized sunglasses, surveying my house like a property to be appraised. "Mom," Rowena called, her voice already trembling. "We need to talk." I wiped my hands on my gardening apron, watching as Ethan straightened his tie and avoided my eyes. Rowena's cheeks were flushed, as though the words had already burned her before they reached me. "We sold the Maplewood house," she said quickly, as if speed would soften the blow. $710,000. Ethan's mother needed the money, and it was the right thing to do. So, we'll stay here a while. Just until things settle. Claudine smiled faintly. Her lips painted the same burgundy as the roses I had just cut. "It's only fair," she added. "Family takes care of family." The suitcase wheels scraped against the pavement as Rowena dragged them closer to the porch. My breath tightened, but my voice did not falter. "No." Rowena blinked, her face stricken. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his mother, who tilted her chin with practiced disdain. The leaves rustled overhead, a quiet applause to the boundary I had drawn. Rowena's hands froze on the suitcase handles, her knuckles whitening. Claudine's sneer deepened, the first crack in the morning's fragile civility. And in that silence, I knew the real confrontation had only just begun. The silence stretched between us, sharp as broken glass. Claudine let it linger only a moment before stepping closer, her perfume thick, her voice low enough for me alone. "You've always been small, Maribel. Small house, small life. No wonder Rowena wants better." I felt the words more than I heard them. Barbs sliding beneath my skin. Rowena shifted uneasily, her eyes darting from me to Claudine, then back again. Ethan stayed rooted at the edge of the drive, shoulders slumped, a spectator to his own undoing. "Mom," Rowena whispered, though the plea carried no strength. "It's just for a little while. You don't have to make this harder." I repeated myself, steady and certain. "No." The word cracked something in her. She turned, and I saw the panic in her face. The desperation of someone torn between the mother who raised her and the mother-in-law who had wrapped coils of expectation around her life. Claudine's hand grazed her arm, a silent push forward. "Rowena," Claudine said sweetly, "show her where your loyalties lie." And then it happened. A flash. A sting. The sudden heat on my cheek. Rowena's hand had struck me, not Claudine's. The sound echoed against the houses on our street, louder than it had any right to be. Across the road. Mrs. Harding paused with her rake mid-air, her mouth parting in shock. A young boy on a bicycle froze at the corner, wheels spinning in place. Even the breeze seemed to halt, as if the mountain air itself disbelieved. My hand lifted instinctively to my cheek, not from pain, but from disbelief that my own daughter had crossed a line no one could uncross. I straightened, voice low but firm. "Get off my porch," Rowena gasped, tears springing. Claudine smirked, victorious. Ethan muttered something no one caught. I reached for my phone, the weight of it cold in my palm. My thumb pressed 911 without hesitation, as the dispatcher's voice answered. Rowena's tears blurred, Claudine's sneer stiffened, and Ethan finally looked up. I gave my address. My voice was steady. My hand did not shake, and by the time I hung up, I knew this would not end at my driveway. The house felt hollow after the patrol car pulled away, its red lights fading down the street. I stood at the window longer than I should have, the sting on my cheek dull now but burning inside. My daughter's face, blurred with tears and anger, stayed with me as I locked the door and slid the chain into place. Sleep was out of the question. I made tea, then drifted toward the back room, the one I rarely entered except for tax season. Against the far wall stood the old oak filing cabinet that had followed me through 3 moves and 30 years of work. The metal handle resisted before giving way, and the drawers opened with their familiar rasp. Inside were the markers of a lifetime contracts, receipts, report cards I couldn't throw away. My fingers moved past folders labeled utilities and insurance, until I found what I was looking for. Rowena. I pulled the folder out and laid it on the desk. Each sheet felt heavier than paper had any right to be. Tuition statements from her nursing school in Raleigh, the canceled checks I'd written to cover what her scholarships could not. I had counted the cost back then $25,000 and told myself it was an investment in her future. There were letters she'd written during clinical rotations, full of exhaustion and gratitude. Reading them now, the ink felt like a promise already broken. Another folder contained the Maplewood purchase documents, mortgage agreements, inspection reports, and there tucked near the back was the promissory note. My signature. Rowena's, Ethan's, and a notary seal. $25,000 again, structured as a loan, not a gift. Payable within 10 years. Interest outlined. Clear and binding. I remembered the conversation vividly Rowena had insisted she'd never take without giving back. I had believed her. I ran my hand across the embossed seal, the paper cool beneath my fingertips. This was more than memory. It was leverage. Proof that sacrifice was not meant to vanish like smoke. I slid the document into a separate envelope, sealing it with care. Tomorrow, I would not walk into this fight empty-handed. The next morning, I drove into Asheville with the envelope of documents resting on the seat beside me like a fragile passenger. The city was waking coffee shops spilling out their regulars, buses groaning through intersections, the mountains standing steady beyond the buildings. I parked near Pack Square and walked with measured steps to the brick office of James Willoughby, a man I hadn't seen in over a decade, but whose name had surfaced in my mind as naturally as breathing. James had been a colleague of my late husband, David, back when they both worked in administration for the county schools. Where David had been measured and academic, James had always carried a lawyer's steel. When he opened the door, his hair was more silver than I remembered, but his eyes still had the quick clarity of someone who weighed everything before speaking. "Mary Bell," he said warmly, ushering me inside. "It's been too long. Sit down. Tell me what brings you." I placed the envelope on his desk and began. I told him about the house on Maplewood, the money Rowena and Ethan had taken from the sale, and the slap that still burned in memory, if not in flesh. He listened without interruption, flipping through the promissory note, scanning the notary's seal, nodding at the clarity of the terms. "This is enforceable," he said at last, tapping the paper. "You can sue for repayment, plus interest accrued. They sold a property tied to this loan without satisfying the debt. That's breach of contract. Plain and simple." The words settled heavy, but not unwelcome. "And Claudine?" I asked. "If the funds were funneled to her, we can subpoena her bank records. That will show intent and misuse. She may not have signed this document, but if she received the money, she'll be drawn in." He began drafting paperwork with a deliberate hand, the scratch of his pen loud in the quiet office. Subpoenas for Ethan and Claudine, notices of suit, the first steps of a process that would no longer stay behind my front door. When he slid the copies across the desk for my signature, my hand trembled only once before steadying by the time I walked back into the autumn air. I knew my private heartbreak had crossed into public record, and there would be no turning back. The packet arrived in a thick manila envelope, stamped with the court's seal. James had warned me the numbers would tell a story all their own, but I wasn't prepared for how sordid the tale would be. I sat at my kitchen table as he spread the records out before me, each page a mirror held up to Claudine's vanity. There were withdrawals for jewelry stores in Charleston, thousands upon thousands for diamonds and pearls that glittered only in her own reflection. A series of charges at spas along the coast, where she had spent weekends on facials and champagne treatments, while Rowena worked double shifts. Airline tickets, luxury hotels, boutique receipts. Then came the renovations a contractor's bill for redecorating her sister's house in Baton Rouge. New marble countertops, imported rugs, designer furniture, all paid for with the proceeds of my daughter's home. "This isn't investment," James said flatly. "This is indulgence. And it's documented." Ethan sat in the corner of the office when we confronted him with the findings. He shrugged, as though $710,000 were only a summer storm, already spent and forgotten. "Mom has her ways," he muttered, his voice carrying no shame, no defense. Rowena, by contrast, grew pale as the pages turned. Her hands twisted the strap of her purse until the leather creaked. She tried to speak, but the words caught. And in that silence, I saw the trap she'd built around herself. She was bound not by love, but by dependence on Ethan's promises, on Claudine's manipulations, on the fantasy that spending money was the same as having a future. I said nothing to her then. The truth was spread plainly across the paper, impossible to deny. Whether she would face it was no longer in my hands. James gathered the records into a file and slid it across the desk toward me. "This will stand in court." I took it, the weight of it pressing against my chest. The empire Claudine had built was nothing but smoke, and now the wind had begun to shift. I drove out toward the rental Claudine had taken on the edge of Asheville, a sprawling villa that never looked lived in, only staged. Its manicured hedges and rented grandeur seemed like a costume she had slipped on. One more disguise to convince the world she belonged to a class she had never truly reached. James told me the deputy would be there before sundown, and I wanted to see the moment for myself. The sky was streaked with amber when the patrol car pulled into the drive. Neighbors paused mid-walk, their leashed dogs tugging at collars as whispers traveled down the street. Curtains shifted in windows. The deputy stepped out, papers in hand, and walked with unhurried certainty to the front door. Rowena and Ethan were already on the porch. Rowena's hands shook as she gripped the railing, her face drawn and pale. Ethan leaned against a column, eyes hollow, the weight of defeat hanging on his shoulders. Then Claudine appeared, sweeping open the door with a force that rattled its hinges. She wore a silk robe, though the evening was cool, and her lipstick was fresh. As if she had prepared for a stage she thought she could command. The deputy's voice carried with practiced authority. "Mrs. Morel, you've been served." The words cut sharper than any insult I could have delivered. Claudine snatched the envelope, tore it open, and scanned the first page before color drained from her face. Her voice rose, shrill, echoing across the quiet cul-de-sac. "This is harassment, lies. You think you can shame me in front of strangers?" Rowena flinched at the sound. Ethan looked away. Neighbors murmured, their eyes fixed on the spectacle unraveling before them. I stayed near my car, steady. I had already changed the locks on my house that morning, already mounted the small cameras above the porch and back door. I would not be caught off guard again. Claudine hurled the papers at the deputy's feet, but the gesture only emphasized her power slipping away. The deputy remained unmoved. His presence, a reminder that this fight no longer belonged to her theater. It belonged to the law. For the first time, I felt the balance shift. And I knew she felt it too. Rowena called 2 days after the papers were served. Her voice was thin, like a string stretched too tight. Can we meet somewhere away from the house? I suggested the old diner off I-26, the one with cracked red booths and a neon sign that never seemed to fully light. She was already there when I arrived, staring into a mug of coffee gone cold. Her shoulders hunched forward, her hair pulled back carelessly, as if the effort of presentation had finally collapsed. "I don't know how it got this far," she said as soon as I sat down. She always knew how to make me feel like I owed her something, like I should be grateful she accepted me. I let her words settle, not rushing her. She twisted her napkin into a tight rope. She said Ethan wouldn't have stayed with me if it weren't for her, that she smoothed things over, paid debts, kept us looking respectable. Every time I tried to say no, she'd remind me of what I'd cost her. She'd bring up the house, the wedding, even the time she bought groceries for us when Ethan's hours were cut. The confession tumbled out. Each line a stone she'd carried too long. I remembered my daughter at 10 years old, trembling after a failed piano recital, certain she had disappointed the world. The same fear flickered in her eyes now. "Rowena," I said gently, "she doesn't own you. You're an adult. You made choices, but you can make different ones now." Her lips trembled. "If I stand against her, she'll cut me off. She'll tell Ethan I betrayed him. She already has," I interrupted. "She's taken your money, your home, your peace. What more can she take? The choice is yours. Either you stand accountable with me or you stand with her. But you cannot straddle both." Rowena's eyes filled, but she didn't answer. She only nodded faintly, as though agreeing with herself rather than me. The waitress refilled our cups, the steam rising between us like a fragile truce. I knew her silence was not surrender, but the prelude to the hardest decision of her life, one that would follow us into the courthouse. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, a mix of order and history pressed into its walls. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside James, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across the aisle, Claudine swept in with her attorney, her hair styled into its usual helmet of control, her lips pulled into a smile that fooled no one. Rowena and Ethan trailed behind, looking like children caught sneaking through the wrong door. Judge Helen Rhine entered, her gavel striking once, and the air shifted. James began with the promissory note. He held it up, the seal and signatures clear. Mrs. Ashcroft loaned her daughter and son-in-law $25,000 for the purchase of their home. Not a gift, a loan. The bank records followed. A litany of indulgence read aloud: jewelry, spa trips, home renovations in Baton Rouge. Each figure struck harder than the last. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Then came the neighbor's testimony. Mrs. Harding took the stand, her voice steady as she described what she saw that day in my driveway, the shouting, my refusal. The moment Rowena's hand met my cheek, Ethan stared at the floor. Rowena wiped her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Claudine tried to fight. Under cross-examination, she claimed the money was hers by right, that family debts were understood and never meant to be enforced. But the paper trail cornered her. Her voice wavered. The mask cracked when it was Rowena's turn. She trembled as she admitted signing documents she never read, trusting Ethan and Claudine to manage everything. The admission landed like a confession, not of malice, but of surrender. Judge Rhine leaned forward, her voice firm. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Repayment of the loan with interest is ordered. Further, the financial dealings of Mrs. Morel will be referred for investigation." The gavel struck again. Claudine paled. Rowena's shoulders shook, and I felt the ground shift beneath us, knowing the verdict was not the end but the beginning of what came next. News traveled faster than I expected. Within weeks of the judgment, calls began reaching me from Louisiana. Old acquaintances of Claudine's wanted to confirm what they had read in the filings. One by one, stories emerged, money borrowed, promises made, debts left to rot. By spring, lawsuits were piling against her in Baton Rouge, each one peeling back another layer of the empire she had built on credit and charm. Ethan fared no better. His real estate ventures, already strained, collapsed under the weight of scrutiny. Bankruptcy was his only option. I heard through James that he signed the papers quietly, his swagger gone, his accounts emptied to near nothing. Rowena came to me soon after, her face drawn but clearer than I had seen in years. "I left him," she whispered, her hands twisting a tissue. "I can't live in the ruins anymore." She spoke of nights filled with shouting, of Claudine's constant pressure, of waking each morning with a knot of dread in her chest. Counseling had been suggested by a colleague, and for once she had agreed to go. I listened, bruised, but not broken, and offered her a seat at my table. "Support," I told her, "is not the same as rescue. I will stand with you, but you must walk your own steps." She nodded, tears catching in her throat. The house felt different with her presence again, quieter, tentative, as if both of us were testing whether trust could be built from fractured pieces. Claudine, meanwhile, retreated into obscurity, the villa emptied, the car repossessed, the phone lines filled with creditors instead of admirers. Her name became less a threat than a warning, whispered in circles that once celebrated her. And as Rowena began piecing herself together, I knew the final reckoning still waited in the quiet of my own home. The winter passed quietly, the kind of season where each morning felt like a clean slate. From my window, I watched the frost melt from the garden, sipping tea from the same mug I had used for years. On the hook by the door hung my key ring, lighter now than it had ever been. Only one brass key remained, its edges worn smooth, its weight steady in my hand. It was more than entry to a house, it was the line between what I allowed and what I would never permit again. Rowena began visiting on weekends, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with nothing but silence. At first we tiptoed around the fractures, speaking of weather and work, but slowly the words turned honest. She told me about counseling sessions, about dreams of a life no longer measured by someone else's approval. I listened, offering presence instead of judgment. Trust, I learned, rebuilds itself like a wall laid brick by brick, not rushed, not forced. Claudine became a ghost. Her name disappeared from conversations. Her debts swallowed her image, and the whispers that once flattered her fell quiet. I no longer waited for her shadow on my doorstep. She had burned through her own smoke, leaving nothing but ashes in places I never had to sweep. Some evenings I sat at the kitchen table, the documents now filed neatly away, untouched. I no longer needed them as shield or sword. My strength was not in the papers, but in the choice I had made to draw boundaries and keep them. I touched the single brass key, letting it rest against my palm, cool and certain. Keys open doors, only respect lets you live inside.